Can I leave now?
It's all going.
What do you mean?
Why are they all going over?
Well, they were sitting down at first, just so they'd have some place to be.
Okay. Why don't we bring them back?
You guys come on back over. Oh, back over? Yeah, no, you're fine. You don't still need to sit down. Okay.
Oh yeah, we're about to get up.
Okay, fine. How are you? Good. Good to see you. Good morning. Welcome to the Birwood Wall and the dedication of this wonderful historic marker. My name is Denise Chapman, and I'm the director of the City's Council's Historic Designation Advisory Board, and I would like to welcome everybody here today. This marker is basically a representation of people preserving places. And that's what this is all about. This is about the dedication and the perseverance of this community and the people and their voices being amplified as they talk about and preserve the history of what it took to deal with the issue of segregation in the city of Detroit as well as the nation. So I'm not going to get into a long detail because we have the city historian who's going to give you a brief overview. We have actually a resident of the neighborhood who has been here and who have been a part of that continuing struggle. And as I look around out here, I see people that I've worked with for the dedication of a district here in the Wyoming 8 Mile neighborhood. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Rochelle Riley, who will introduce the mayor of the city of Detroit. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you so much for being here. As Director of Arts and Culture and Entrepreneurship and History, these moments are very important to us. And no mayor has done more in Detroit's history to pay attention to our total history and to make sure that we're honoring our culture than Mayor Mike Duggan. When I went to him with the idea of a city historian, it was the easiest sell I've had in 3 years. So I so thank him for that. I thank him for bringing Jamon aboard. And I now bring you my boss, the Mayor of Detroit.
Well, this is a special day and a recognition that is long overdue. It is really important to remember the history of discrimination in this city. It still casts its shadow today. In 1925, at the corner of Charlevoix and Garland, Dr. Ossian Sweet An African-American doctor in this city bought a house in a white neighborhood, and when he went to move in, he and his family were greeted with mobs that were pelting the house with rocks. They shot in self-defense, killed somebody across the street, and the story drew national attention. The NAACP came in, took his defense, brought in Clarence Darrow, and the family was acquitted by jurors. And it stood for the principle that it didn't matter what color you are, you're entitled to defend your own house. But the strategies to keep African Americans out of white neighborhoods got more sophisticated. And in 1944, a couple by the name of Orsil and Minnie McGee, a black couple, bought a house on the west side on Seabolt, except that the deed itself said the house could only be sold to persons who were Caucasian. They decided to challenge that because neighborhoods were being kept white by deed restrictions. And a young NAACP attorney came to Detroit, came out in their living room in Seabolt and said he'd take their case. That attorney, Thurgood Marshall, took the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court and got restrictive covenants struck down as unconstitutional across this country. And if you go over to Seabolt today, there is an historic marker that recognizes it. If you go over to Garland today, when I was the prosecutor, I was troubled by the fact that there was no recognition of what had happened to the Sweet family. And so I worked with then Governor Jennifer Granholm, and there is, in front of that house, a state historic marker. And Rochelle Riley's leading an effort with the Baxter family that owns the house to make the Sweet House a museum and make that entire area of the block an historic place. But here on Birwood, you're going to hear from people who know the history better than I do. Because not only was there active discrimination, the federal government very intentionally discriminated against African Americans. And so one of the strategies that black families who were doing well did was they said, okay, we're being met with such hostility in white neighborhoods, let's build our own. And they started to move out into the 7 and 8 mile area, which was still country in the 30s and 40s, built the beautiful Conant Gardens neighborhood on the east side and started to build a neighborhood out here. And then as this city started to fill up, and it was really the late 30s when Franklin Roosevelt started to arm Europe even before Pearl Harbor, people poured up from the South in huge numbers and started to fill housing. And all of a sudden, this area, which housed an African-American neighborhood, became attractive enough. Now, it's farther away from the factories, it's farther away from downtown, it had been less desirable, but now they wanted to build. Except there was a black neighborhood nearby. And the federal government, the FHA, with its policy of redlining, said, we won't make guaranteed loans to houses built in racially mixed neighborhoods. I want you to think about this. You had blacks and whites working side by side in factories, and even when they were making the same amount of money for the same amount of work, lived in very different neighborhoods because the federal government was guaranteeing the loans to build the nicer houses in the white neighborhoods and was not doing the same, leaving members who were African American to fend for themselves. And so when the developer wanted to build a new neighborhood here, the FHA said, we won't loan for it because the people of color live too close. And he proposed a wall, which, as you can see, is not a wall that really kept people from climbing over, but he promised that on this side of the wall, he would only sell to white people. At which point the federal government, under the Roosevelt administration, said, that's great, approved the projects out here. And here we are generations later. But it's been very true that historically, the white neighborhoods were built more strongly because they had the backing of the federal loans than the black neighborhoods. It's discrimination that people in this city know all too well. And when you think it's ancient history, it really hit me a few years ago when we bought the land for the new Jeep plant over off of Mack Avenue, and we acquired a bunch of those old parcels. And they brought me in the deeds. And the deeds to some of those parcels we were buying for the Jeep plant said on them, can only be sold to Caucasians. The deed restrictions were still there. They may not have been enforceable, but they're still on those deeds. It hasn't been that long ago. We are still recovering from that racial discrimination in this country. We work at recovering from it every day, but we can't recover from it if we aren't aware of it and we don't understand how we got here. And that was a big reason why when Rochelle Riley said to me, we need a Detroit historian, I said, that's exactly what we need. Except oftentimes the history you read in the books is not necessarily the history of people who have lived. And I said to Rochelle, as long as you find a Detroit historian who's lived this, who will tell the story from longtime Detroiters, it would fill a huge hole in this city. And I'm very proud to introduce to you now our Detroit historian, Jamon Jordan.
Well, the mayor has told the story, but this wall tells another story, or even larger story. It tells the story of African Americans leaving the South during the Great Migration from 1910 to 1970. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans will leave the South, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and come to northern cities like Cleveland and Cincinnati and Chicago and Detroit. And they're coming to the city of Detroit to run away from the strict Jim Crow that exists down south. And they're coming to the city of Detroit to have a better life in the auto factories and the other industries in the city of Detroit. But they're running into Detroit's version of Jim Crow. And as they come to this area, building their own homes, this would be applauded. In fact, we applaud these kinds of stories when it's the immigrant story. When people come from far away, from other countries, and come to America and make a life for themselves, but they're met with racism. They're met with racism by private homeowners who put racial restrictive covenants in their deeds. They're met with racism by the real estate agents who steer them to only certain neighborhoods. They're met with racism and discrimination by banks and mortgage companies who block them from getting home loans in certain areas. And they're blocked, most of all, by the federal government. The United States federal government in its National Housing Act of 1934 and 1937 restricts the funding, the subsidizing, the backing of home loans for African Americans, blocks them from getting most of these home loans, and awards these home loans to white working class people. And so African Americans and whites are working in the same factories. They're working in Packard, they're working in Dodge, they're working in Cadillac, they're working in Dodge, Maine together, making about the same amount of money, income equal. But because whites are getting guaranteed home loans by the FHA, within a couple of decades, we will have a wealth gap. Housing discrimination, which this wall symbolizes, is not just racism, it is that, but it is also environmental racism. The fact that certain neighborhoods have more pollution than others is a result of housing discrimination. We just don't talk about it as if that's the same thing. School inequality is housing discrimination. We just speak about it as if it's something separate. And the wealth gap that we have today is largely the result of housing discrimination. African Americans being unable to access housing in the 1930s and 40s and 50s as working class people, while the federal government is picking winners and losers and allowing and backing the home loans of white working class people. This is we're living with the legacy of that, but we're also living with the legacy of people who, despite all of that, kept moving forward. People like Bernice Avery, who lived in this neighborhood and was an activist and fought so that the African Americans could get home loans backed by the FHA in this area. People like Alfonso Wells, who was an activist in this community, and he is depicted on the wall itself, and this park is named after Alfonso Wells. And of course, people like Teresa Moon, who is still an activist in this community, who is still moving this community forward. So this wall tells this long story, and we ought to understand this story because segregation and discrimination is not just a Southern phenomenon. It is a national phenomenon, and we need to understand how it showed up in the city of Detroit. Thank you.
Are we feeling something now? Yeah. All right, I felt I was in church there for a moment. All right, we're going to keep moving it on. And our next speaker, I'm going to introduce the councilwoman from this district, Ms. Angela Calloway. Thank you.
And good morning. And if you hadn't gotten a hearty welcome to District 2, that I am so proud to represent on the Detroit City Council. It is my honor and privilege to do so. The wall, erected in 1941, was intended to be something negative. but it's ending up being something quite positive because look at all of us here today. And I thank the Lord for the sun because it could have been raining and in Michigan, possibly snow. So I thank God that the sun is shining directly on us gathered here today. So again, welcome to District 2, and it is my honor and privilege to bring up the historian for this area, someone who welcomed me into her home and gave me the history of this area from a little girl's point of view. I want to thank you for the welcome, Teresa Moon. Thank you.
Okay. Teresa Moon speaks very real, okay? I'm not a historian, as they say. I'm a person that grew up in this neighborhood, moved here in 1959, and was subject to seeing this wall every day. But the wall never made a difference to us because that time had passed like it's passed now. It's been 81 years since that wall was erected. There are new barriers. There are new red lines. There are new injustices. There are people underserved. And a lot of those people live in my community. And that's what I represent, this community right here. We say 8 Mile for life because it means a lot to us, you know, to have grown up in an area that has just recently been designated as a historical area. Not just the wall, but there are other historical landmarks within this community, between Livernois and Myers, between 8 Mile and Pembroke. So, you know, my whole thing, my whole passion is about making sure that the quality of life is good for the people that I live around, making sure that it's understood that we deserve equality just like everybody else, making sure that, you know, the love and the commitment and the strength that was passed down from the people who had the tenacity to keep this community together never dies. So it's all about 8 Mile for me. That's all I have to say.
As we listen to those voices and those lost narratives and voices that are now being amplified for the first time, and sometimes we forget these stories. So it's important and it behooves us to make sure that their voices are heard and those narratives are interwoven into that wall behind us. And the one way of doing that is through the state has been very helpful with grants and allowing this area to be recognized and to allow the city of Detroit to work with them to do a survey to identify those sites that Ms. Moon just spoke of. So at this point, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Deputy SHPO, State Historic Preservation Officer, Martha McPhail Faze. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be here. So I want to thank you all for inviting me into your community. It's a beautiful day, but we are hearing about some really serious history here. And we acknowledge that at the State Historic Preservation Office. If you don't know who we are, we're a state agency, although we operate under a federal mandate, and our job is to identify and preserve and protect historic resources throughout the state. So it is our great honor and privilege to be able to participate today and to be able to talk to you a bit more about the kinds of work we're doing at the state level regarding civil rights sites throughout the state of Michigan. The National Park Service, and we operate under funding from the National Park Service, has long acknowledged that there are inequities in the nation's historic preservation programs. And since 1997, the Park Service has taken steps to correct that inequity by establishing grant programs to assist in the identification, documentation, and rehabilitation of sites significant to the history of America's underrepresented communities. In 2016, in collaboration with the Detroit Historic Designation Advisory Board, the State Historic Preservation Office received a Historic Preservation Fund African American Civil Rights grant to document 20th century civil rights sites in Detroit. And to assist in their identification, an advisory board of local historians was formed, some of whom are here today, and I would like to acknowledge Jamon Jordan, Ken Coleman, okay, yeah, Denise Chapman, Carolyn Carter, is Carolyn Carter here? DeWitt Dykes, and Marcia Battle Philpott. Thank you all for your contributions to this effort. I'd also like to acknowledge Sandra Little. Where'd you go, Sandra? There you are. Thank you. Of Quinn Evans Architects, who along with Ruth Mills identified more than 100 of Detroit's civil rights sites. Since the project began, we have been able to list 7 Detroit civil rights sites on the National Register of Historic Places, the nation's most significant sites worthy of preservation. And these include, of course, the Birwood Wall behind me, and some of these which the mayor mentioned, and I'll just go through the list, but the Orcel and Minnie McGee House, also the Sojourner Truth Homes, the WGPR-TV William Bands Broadcast Center, the Shrine of the Black Madonna, New Bethel Baptist Church, and the Rosa and Raymond Parks flat, their apartment. And we are currently working on an 8th nomination for Vaughn's Bookstore, African American bookstore in the city. I would like to also acknowledge my staff member, Amy Arnold. Would you raise your hand? Amy has done a lot of the heavy lifting for this project, so thank you, Amy. So the Birwood Wall Historical Marker, and that was, the Birwood Wall, I should mention, was just listed in the National Register in 2021. And the marker that we're dedicating today is one of 3 that are being erected in Detroit. The others will honor the history of Sojourner Truth Homes and the 1963 Walk to Freedom. So again, thank you for allowing the State Historic Preservation Office to be a part of your gathering today, and I am so honored to be here. Thank you.
As we continue to talk about equity and preservation, both racially and economically, I'm going to bring up Brian Egan, who is the president of the Michigan Historical Commission. He is, to give a few short remarks, he is the president of the commission who basically identifies what markers are going to be erected. And I want to bring him up, and he'll talk a little bit about its history, the history of the marker program, and where they're going with their program in the future. Thank you. Mr. Egan.
Thank you. Honorable Mayor, distinguished guests, I guess this is a pure Michigan day, I would say for sure. It is an honor to be here with you today. We have over 1,800 historical markers throughout the state of Michigan. There are a few in Tennessee, Kentucky, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and there is one in France. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend that marker dedication. Each of these markers tell a small but very significant story for the local community, the local stories. But collectively, they represent a redolent mosaic of the Great Lakes State's history. And that's something that's so important. And one thing that's so beautiful about the State Historical Marker Program, communities can come together like this to tell their story, to tell and share with the state, with the country, with the world, their story. And that's very important. And collectively, they all add up to a great story. Maybe it's not always positive. Maybe it's not always something we want to share, but it's something that reminds us and inspires us that even though we've made a lot of progress, there are a lot of challenges to move forward to still make this a more perfect union. These markers commemorate the events, the people, places that define Michigan, what it's all about. They are physical reminders of our values, ideals of service and sacrifice, of tragic stories, of celebratory achievements. They educate and they inspire, and hopefully that they will inspire more stories to come out, those untold stories, the ones that may have been marginalized or forgotten about, or maybe just not thought of as important. And we're really excited about this. The Michigan Historical Commission is working very heavily in communities throughout the state to help uplift a lot of those stories. We're going through and if you will, an audit of our state historical markers that may not have had a balanced story told, and we're trying to make sure that all voices can be heard. So on behalf of the Michigan Historical Commission, the state of Michigan, and Governor Whitmer, thank you for this marker, for coming together and supporting this, and congratulations.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to say that history lost is history that can be repeated. So every time we are educating, we are making sure that current and future generations are prepared to handle the way that we live, to make it better, to make progress. I also want to make an announcement because I'm so excited. The next time we hope to see all of you here is when we celebrate the one-year anniversary of having our city historian, Jamon Jordan, on the job. He's going, thank you. Yes, give it to him. He's going to give his first annual lecture at Gordon Park. It's Gordon Park now, but as you know, it was the site of the beginning of a rebellion that happened in 1967. He will not be talking about what happened in 1967. He will be talking about everything that Detroit came back to be what it is today. Detroit is not coming back. Detroit is back. We're doing amazing things, and my colleague Jeremy Jordan, and I'm Jeremy Jordan. I'm sorry, Jeremy. Jeremy Thomas and I are going to pass these out so you can take them with you. We hope to see you on October 25th at Gordon Park at 12th and Claremont, which is now Rosa Parks and Claremont. Thank you so very much for this.
Very briefly, don't let this be the last time you come to this park and to the Birwood Wall. It is open. It is to the public. It is a public park. Tell your friends and family and make it one of those places, a destination point. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.